Hi, welcome back. I imagine that most of those listening to this lecture are coming to the study of sacred texts from a Judeo-Christian background, or at least have a familiarity with that tradition. When we think of Scripture from that perspective, we might have in mind something like the following. Scripture is a written book that claims some sort of divine origin, which tells us something about the life or ideas of the founder of the religion, and which is considered especially sacred and authoritative by believers, which they study regularly and look to for guidance and wisdom, and which defines their beliefs and reveals truths about the universe. One of the great things about studying world religions is that it gives us a chance to rethink our assumptions, and most of those statements don't really apply to the sacred texts of Hinduism. So I'll go back through the list, and then we'll see how it looks from a Hindu perspective. First, a scripture is a written book. Actually, rather than a single book of scripture, Hindus have hundreds of sacred texts, and they've traditionally valued oral rather than literary transmission. So their holiest compositions, the Vedas, were thought too sacred to put into written form. Instead, they were memorized generation after generation by ritual specialists who were the Brahmin priests. Second is that the scriptures tell us something about a founder, but there's no founder in Hinduism. In fact, the term itself, Hinduism, is a word created by Westerners in the 18th century to refer to the many religious beliefs and practices of people living in the Indian subcontinent. The word Hindu is an old Persian word for people living beyond the Indus River. What we term Hinduism encompasses a tremendous variety of beliefs and rituals and deities, though they generally share a reverence for the Vedas, and that's going to be the subject of this lecture. Together, they constitute the world's oldest living religious tradition, but there's not one person who started it all. And in fact, there's not really even one religion. It's more like a family of related religions. Okay. Second is that scriptures are especially sacred. Some parts of the Hindu canon are indeed considered more sacred than others. And oddly enough, the Bhagavad Gita, probably the most beloved and widely read of Hindu scriptures, is not in the most sacred category of Hindu texts. In addition, there isn't a strict boundary between scripture and commentary in the sense that this is scripture and everything that comes after is commentary. So some explanatory works eventually made it into the canon and continued to be written into the 17th and 18th century. There's no Hindu pope or an all-church committee to decide what is or isn't scripture. It's more a matter of tradition or denominational lineages, and it's much more flexible than in Judaism or Christianity. Okay, remember we said that scripture is studied by believers. Ordinary Hindus may try to live their lives in accordance with principles from the Dharma Shastras. We'll hear more about those in a later lecture. They may have learned important life lessons from listening to Hindu epics like the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and they've heard the Vedas chanted at festivals and life cycle rituals like weddings, but they generally don't read or study the scriptures. That's mostly left to the Brahmins, sort of the uppermost of the caste system. Other members of the three upper castes, and those are defined as people who have been twice born through initiation, they have access to the sacred texts. But it's part of caste duty only for Brahmins to read and to study them. One exception may be the Bhagavad Gita, which is kind of read and studied by lots of Hindus, regardless of their caste. Sacred texts are important in Hinduism, but they're not central to the religion in the way that the Bible is in Judaism or Christianity, or perhaps the Quran is in Islam. Many believers would consider taking part in festivals and pilgrimages or the worship of icons or images, making devotional offerings, showing hospitality, or doing one's duty to family or community. All those things may be more important to their religious life than scriptures. And as I said, the Vedas in particular are a concern of the religious elites rather than of the masses. We said before that scriptures are oftentimes a source of doctrine. And perhaps the strangest thing about Hindu scripture, at least from a Western perspective, is that the Vedas, the holiest, most powerful, awe-inspiring scriptures in the tradition, don't convey much cognitive information. Their content matters less than their ritual function. They're chanted in an ancient language, in Sanskrit, in early Sanskrit. And even the priest doing the ceremony may not understand exactly what things mean. They're mostly concerned, the priests are mostly concerned with the exact pronunciations of the sacred words. The Vedas are directed toward practical ritual processes, and rather than telling worshipers something about the gods, they actually connect them with divinity or with the harmonious order of the universe. Perhaps it's good that we're starting our survey of sacred texts of the world with some scriptures that seem to break all the rules. Here's the basic framework of Hindu sacred texts. The key distinction is between Shruti, that's what is heard, and Smrti, what's remembered. Shruti, and that's basically the Vedas, is considered to have been revealed. So the Vedas consist of 4 collections of hymns known as the Samhitas, along with their oldest commentaries, the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. Ancient sages called rishis, and that means seers, perceive these mantras, and those are sacred syllables, perceive these mantras resonating through the cosmos and pass them on to their disciples orally through direct sort of face-to-face communication. According to some Hindus, the Vedas were written by God. Others hold that they were eternal or uncreated. The word Veda means knowledge. The oldest of the 4 Samhitas, the Rig Veda, which means knowledge of the verses, dates to perhaps 1500 BCE and consists of 1,028 hymns divided into 10 books. The poems are addressed to various gods, such as Indra, who is the thunderbolt-wielding warrior god, Agni, the god of fire, and Soma, who's a personification of a mysterious hallucinogenic substance. And these were meant to be chanted, all these hymns, as an accompaniment to rituals or fire sacrifices. The Samaveda, which means knowledge of the chants, and this is the second of the Samhitas, includes songs and melodies used in sacrifices, with the words mostly taken from the Rig Veda and then instructions on their recitation. The third of the Samhitas is the Yajur Veda, knowledge of ritual instructions, it means, and that has prose formulas and prayers that are chanted by priests in rituals. And finally is the Atharva Veda, and that means it's the knowledge of the Atharvans, it's another word for priests. And that consists of incantations and magical spells to ward off evil spirits or illnesses, to gain a husband or a wife, or to prevent miscarriages, and their charms to say when one is going to build a house or going into battle, when a person is worried about crops or family arguments, or even to bring luck to gamblers. It's a very practical sort of scripture. This last Veda, the Atharva Veda, is the youngest of the 4 Samhitas. It perhaps dates back to 800 BCE, and it's not considered quite as authoritative or as prestigious as the other 3. Each of the 4 Samhitas is associated with texts called Brahmanas, and those are ritual handbooks with very detailed instructions about how these rituals and chants are to be performed and enunciated. There are also Aranyakas, and those are wilderness books, which are explanations of symbolism and the inner meaning of ritual. The idea there is that the information they contain is so holy that it can't really be taken into cities. It needs to stay out in the countryside. And then the 4th part of the Vedas are the Upanishads, and that means sitting near. The idea is that students would sit near a teacher and hear these explanations. The Upanishads are philosophical explanations of the concepts within the Vedas, such as Atman, which is the soul, and Brahman, ultimate reality. The Upanishads, the latest of these Vedic texts, form the basis of Hindu philosophy, and with them, we finally get an emphasis on ideas and knowledge rather than ritual and ritual instructions. There are 108 classic Upanishads, of which about 13, are considered the most important. They were written from 700 to 200 BCE, and I'll talk more about that in the next lecture. Altogether, the 4 Vedas, so it's the Samhitas plus their 3 collections of associated texts. So each of the Samhitas has Aranyakas and Upanishads and Brahmanas. All those together make up Shruti. It's a lot of literature to memorize, and different Brahmanic families specialized in different texts. The second major category of Hindu scripture is smriti, what is remembered. Smriti, we'll call it, what is remembered. These texts were produced after the Vedas and are thought to have been written by humans, so they're not eternal or they're not written by the gods, but they're nevertheless inspired. While they're not as holy or as authoritative as the Vedas, they've probably played a more important role in the everyday lives of Hindus for the last 2,500 years. The Smriti include the two epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, and those were written from maybe 200 BCE to 400 CE. We'll talk more about those in Lecture 4. The Dharma Shastras, from 200 to 300 CE, are regulations for everyday living, like the laws of Manu. We'll hear more about that in a future lecture. And the Puranas of 400 to 1000 CE are myths and legends about the gods. Altogether, those make up Smriti, what's remembered. I realize that this is a lot to get your head around, and we'll spend the next few lectures talking about several of the most important texts in these broad categories. But the Vedas are a special case. For other Hindu scriptures, the meanings of the words matter. There are stories and doctrines and rules that can be analyzed and understood. But the Vedas are revered for their sounds rather than their meanings. How exactly might this work for ordinary Hindus? Every morning at dawn and every evening at twilight, millions of Hindus recite the Gayatri mantra. It begins with the line, Om Bhur Bhuva Svah. The first syllable, the famous mantra Om, doesn't mean anything, but it channels the cosmic, mystical vibration of ultimate reality. One of the Upanishads says, the word which all the Vedas repeat, and what they say is equivalent to all austerities, seeking which lead men into religious life. The word I declare to you summarily, it is Om. For this syllable alone is Brahman. For this syllable alone is the Supreme. For knowing this syllable alone, whatever one wishes, that is his. The next three words are invocations of the three realms, the earth, the atmosphere, and the sky. Then follows 3 lines of the mantra proper, taken from a hymn to the sun in the Rig Veda. I don't know Sanskrit, I'm not Hindu, so I won't attempt to pronounce these sacred words, but you should go to YouTube, where you can hear chanted versions or versions set to music, often repeated 108 times. That's a sacred number. These videos routinely get millions and millions of hits. The Gayatri mantra should be maybe off your radar, but it obviously means a great deal to many, many people. The meaning of the mantra is something like, we meditate on the radiant glory of the sun, may he inspire our intelligence. And with the idea that the sun is connected with light, which is connected with knowledge and consciousness. But the mantra is always recited in Sanskrit, even though no one in India today speaks Sanskrit as their first language. In fact, it's a dead language, older than Greek or Latin. Yet giving voice to those ancient syllables, sort of again and again, as Robert Lester explains, he says, it dispels the darkness. It destroys the effects of bad deeds and harmonizes body and mind and spirit with the physical worlds and with the primal universal forces. What a lovely way to start and to end one's day. The Gayatri mantra has been known as the mother of Veda, and it was taught to young upper caste males as part of the ceremony that began their study of the Vedas. In traditional India, there are 4 major castes. They're the Brahmins, who are the priests or teachers, the Kshatriyas, the warriors or rulers, the Vaishyas, who are farmers and merchants, and finally the Shudras, or laborers or servants. The so-called untouchables, now referred to in India as Dalits, were out of the system. They were without castes or were outcasts. Only the 3 highest castes were allowed to participate in Vedic religion, since they claimed descent from the Indo-Aryan migrations that came into India around 1500 BCE. Those were the people that originated the Vedas, and only they could study them later. Though the Brahmins, remember that's the uppermost of the castes, were really specialists who memorized the Vedas and kept the traditions and rituals going. You can imagine the effort and care that it took to memorize long, complex scriptures in an ancient language and then pass them on exactly over the course of many centuries. The Vedas were in existence for over 1,000 years before they were ever written down, and for the next 2 millennia, they were still mainly transmitted orally from teacher to student, since transcribing the sacred words was thought to diminish their power, or it might even be sacrilegious. One of the Aranyakas states that a student, as it says, should not recite the Veda after he had eaten meat, seen blood or a dead body, had intercourse, or engaged in writing. Okay, one of those may seem a little bit strange to you. I can imagine the taboos against sexual activity or eating meat or seeing dead bodies, but writing is put in that same category. There's something wrong about written scripture from the Vedic perspective. The Brahmins took their duties seriously, and they jealously guarded the sacred words that had been entrusted to them. The 19th century scholar Max Muller, who edited the 50-volume Sacred Books of the East, reported hearing of an English gentleman who had a very sacred hymn of the Veda, the Gayatri, printed at Calcutta. Muller continues, "The Brahmins were furious at this profanation, and when the gentleman died soon after, they looked upon his premature death as the vengeance of the offended gods." There were, however, Hindu reform movements in the 19th century that encouraged all Hindus to recite the Gayatri mantra, regardless of caste or gender, and that practice has continued to the present. Even now, however, although most Hindus would describe the Vedas as their most sacred scriptures, they probably don't know much about their contents, because the Vedas are hardly ever encountered apart from ritual functions, where they're always chanted in Sanskrit by Brahmins taking care to reproduce exactly the correct pronunciation and the exact pitch and rhythm. By the way, Brahmin experts in the Vedas were called pandits, which is where we get our English word pundit. So far, we've encountered some important ideas that will reappear later in the course in other religious traditions. For example, Zoroastrianism and Sikhism have sacred poetry as more important than prose. Another similarity that we'll see is that Buddhists also began with scriptures that were transmitted orally, and they were keenly aware that once things are written down, you lose that direct connection between teacher and student, of always encountering sacred texts in the presence of someone who's already mastered them. We'll again see the importance of recitation in original languages in both Judaism and Islam. And Muslims themselves have a long tradition of memorizing their scripture, actually memorizing the whole Quran. Mantras are used extensively by Tibetan Buddhists, who, like Taoists and Mormons, are wary of sacred words being taken out of their original ritual contexts. Actually, speaking of being taken out of context, the Gayatri mantra was used in the theme song for the 2004 television series Battlestar Galactica. I know that Hindu reformers wanted it more widely used and spread, but I'm not sure what they would have thought about that. And the significance of miraculous syllables also finds its way into Christianity. You may know that the New Testament was written in ancient Greek, even though Jesus and his disciples spoke Aramaic. The Gospel of Mark, telling the story of Jesus raising a young girl from the dead, says, "He took her by the hand and said to her, 'Talitha cum,' which means, 'Little girl, get up.'" Do you see what's happening there? Mark wants you to hear those exact Aramaic words that Jesus spoke, even if you don't understand Aramaic. In fact, he does this 3 more times in his gospel, where he gives you an Aramaic phrase that was said by Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that Christianity got this from Hinduism. In fact, that's not the case. But you see a similar sense that the exact words matter sometimes, even if you don't understand the content. At this point in our lecture, however, you may be a bit frustrated. Yes, you say, I understand that the Vedas are more valued for their ritual function than for their content, that people hearing the sounds of ancient Sanskrit at festivals and weddings and funerals know that those words have been carefully and lovingly preserved through the centuries, even if very few at the ceremony, including the priests, really know what they mean. But still, I want to know, what's in the Vedas? What are they saying? It's a natural question, particularly for people coming from a Judeo-Christian background. Religious studies scholars sometimes talk about Protestant bias. That is, looking at other faiths through the lens of the Christian Reformation. assuming that scriptures are at the heart of a religion, that the oldest texts represent the purest form of that faith, and that those documents can best be understood through the scholarly endeavors of textual criticism, historical analysis, and translation. This approach may give us a somewhat skewed view of Hinduism, but there's no question that the pioneering Protestant scholars of the 19th century did amazing work in building bridges and promoting interreligious understanding. I keep coming back to the example of Max Müller. He lived from 1823 to 1900. He was a German Lutheran who lived most of his life in England as a professor at Oxford. At a time when no one in the West really knew what was in the Vedas, and when there were only handwritten manuscripts, because the text had never been published before, not even in India, Müller worked for 24 years with manuscript collections in Paris and in London to produce the first scholarly edition of the Sanskrit Rig Veda in 6 volumes. Somewhat ironically, Müller himself never visited India throughout his life. Müller thought of the Rig Veda as the oldest book in the world, and one that would provide a key to the earliest, most primitive forms of language, thought, religion, and society. He translated many of the hymns into English as part of his Sacred Books of the East series, and then Ralph Griffith translated the whole thing in 1896 based on Müller's Sanskrit text. Even Brahmins in India came to appreciate Müller's labors as they began to investigate their own traditions with the tools of modern scholarship. Such devotion to other people's sacred texts is admirable, even if the European approach was foreign to Hinduism. As the Harvard scholar Wilfred Cantwell Smith observed, turning the Hindu Veda into a written book is an entrancing instance of a 19th century Western cultural imperialism, here quietly imposing the Western sense of Scripture. But the results are fascinating. Let's look at some of the examples from the Rig Veda, the oldest and most prestigious of the Samhitas, of the 4 Vedas. The book begins with a hymn to Agni, the god of fire, which sometimes speaks of him as a god of the priests, as a priest of the gods, and as the sacrificial fire itself. I extol Agni, the household priest, the divine minister of the sacrifice, the chief priest, the bestower of blessings. May that Agni, who is to be extolled by ancient and modern seers, conduct the gods here. Through Agni, may one gain day by day wealth and welfare, which is glorious and replete with heroic sons. As I mentioned earlier, the Rig Veda consists of 1,028 hymns divided into 10 books. Most of these are praises and petitions of the gods, like the one you just heard. Petitions to Agni and Indra and Soma being the most popular. There are references to myths, such as how the sky warrior Indra defeated a dragon-like creature and thus released the life-giving monsoon-bringing waters. And the entire 9th book of the Rig Veda is devoted to hymns to Soma, a mysterious, intoxicating substance that was crucial to the sacrificial rites. It says there, I have tasted the sweet drink of life, knowing that it inspires good thoughts and joyous expansiveness to the extreme, that all the gods and mortals seek it together, calling it honey. We have drunk the Soma, we have become immortal. We've gone to the light. We've found the gods. What hatred and malice of a mortal can do to us now, O immortal one? Other hymns are addressed to sky and earth, to storm gods, to solar gods and other deities, and to the components of the sacrifices. So there are hymns to the priests and the clarified butter and speech. In a hymn to Varuna, the guardian of the cosmic order, who sees everything and punishes transgressors, we hear a plea for forgiveness. Was the offense so great, Varuna, that you want to crush your friend and praise her? O you who are impossible to deceive, wholly self-sustaining, you will explain this to me. I would swiftly humble myself before you with reverence to be free of guilt. There are also injunctions to moral behavior. One of the hymns says, whoever has food and acts ungenerously toward someone desiring food, his heart hardens, and then later his unsympathetic friend also gives no food. Right, so the idea is if you have food and you don't give it to someone else, in another day, you're going to be hungry and someone is going to withhold from you. And then there's a touching hymn in which the mourners plead with death not to take anyone else. Go away, death, by another path that is your own, different from the road of the gods. I say to you who have eyes, who have ears, do not injure our children or our men. And then that's followed by a tender request to the grave that says, open up, earth. The idea is that they're going to bury ashes here. Open up, earth, do not crush him. Wrap him as a mother wraps a son in the edge of her skirt. The last two hymns come from the 10th book of the Rig Veda, which is thought to be one of the later parts of that Samhita. The hymns in that section tend to address more universal or philosophical themes, and so they're commonly included in anthologies of world scripture. In fact, it's rare to see any English selections that don't include one or more hymns from Book 10 about creation. These seem to be contradictory. Sometimes the universe comes from sacred speech or from non-existence or from a mother goddess. There's a story about a primordial giant who was sacrificed by the gods, and then his various body parts became the earth and the sun, and the earth and the sky, and the sun and the moon and animals, and the 4 human castes, with the Brahmins coming from his head, and the warriors coming from his arms, and the farmers coming from his thighs, and then the Shudras, the servants, coming from his feet at the bottom. So a sense of the social order comes from this god. There's also a hymn in this 10th book about creation, or about other things like creation, that suggests that even the Creator himself might not know exactly how this all came into being. Yet the very fact that the English anthologies always include something about the origins of the cosmos is itself another example of Protestant bias. We care about creation stories because the Bible starts with a dramatic example in Genesis, and we're curious about other people's beliefs on the matter. It came as a shock to Western scholars to discover that the Chinese don't really have any ancient creation myths. Where the world came from was not a burning question for them. They were much more interested in the origins of human culture, things like agriculture and marriage and writing that were thought to have been produced by ancient sages. So there are all sorts of interesting things in the Vedas, but it's important to keep in mind that when we read translations looking for bits of wisdom or beauty or poignancy, we're doing something with these sacred texts that's rather foreign, at least foreign from a Hindu perspective. Analyzing and discussing the meaning of specific passages might seem natural in a college class or an academic lecture series like this one. Yet for Hindus, the Vedas are not really supposed to be understood cognitively so much as experienced in a traditional setting of sound and color and fragrance and movement and devotion. In the next lecture, we'll take up the latest layer of the Shruti. Remember, that's the part of the Hindu scriptures that's what is heard, the most sacred part. And we'll be looking particularly at the Upanishads, which are philosophical texts whose ideas have been vigorously analyzed and debated throughout Indian history. We'll be on more familiar territory here, but even so, as we bring this lecture on the Vedas to an end, it's good to be reminded of the immense variety of world scriptures and the different ways that people have used and been inspired by them. Today, Max Mueller is remembered as a founder of the field of religious studies, but his ideas on the origins and historical development of religions has mostly been superseded. Nevertheless, you'll still often hear his famous quote about how religion can only be understood through comparison. Max Mueller said, "He who knows one knows none."